Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. " 2024 saw the publication in English of a book entitled Western Marxism: How It Was Born, How It Died, How It Can Be Reborn, by the Italian Marxist historian of philosophy Domenico Losurdo, who died in 2018. This book is hailed by its publisher, Monthly Review Press, as, in their words, paradigm shifting and providing a fresh and challenging perspective on purportedly radical thinkers that's grounded in what they call the positive project of reigniting anti-imperialist Marxism. It's been widely promoted in podcasts and other ways by its editor, the philosopher Gabriel Rockhill. Jacobin's editors saw it as important enough to merit a review on their website. And received a certain amount of attention. So Losurdo did write a number of significant books on the history of ideas, including on liberalism and the philosophers Nietzsche and Hegel, books on each of them. So the question is his Western Marxism a useful contribution? To discuss this, I'm joined on this episode of Victor's Children by Joshua Nicholas Pineda. Could you introduce yourself to listeners, please?
Hi, I'm Joshua Nicholas Pineda. I did my dissertation work at the New School for Social Research in the philosophy department under Chinzi Aruza. I just mention her name here because I might later on drag academic philosophy as a discipline, in which case I will just foreground that I don't mean her. She is lovely. And currently I am a web editor for Spectre Journal, which I hope everyone will go out and read. I should note, though, that at Spectre, we mostly end up talking about politics with each other. So for the more theoretical discussions, I would kind of want to distance myself from them because I don't want it to be taken that my views are somehow representative of the board.
Right. Thanks so much. So let's start off by asking the question, who was Domenico Losurdo? Could you introduce his academic work and his politics to listeners?
Sure. So it's odd answering this question because I'm not necessarily a Losurdo scholar, but as far as I know, Domenico Losurdo was born in the 1940s in Italy, where he became active during the 1960s. Politically, I would say that, he was primarily associated with the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, although there have been splits and reconstitutions of that party throughout their history, which he played a part. And notably, at least for this discussion, he became aligned with a segment of the Italian left that had aligned with China during the Sino-Soviet split. I'd say intellectually, he was trained in philosophy, and as I understand it, taught mostly in philosophy. His work, I guess, could best be described as, say, like philosophical treatise / intellectual biographies of major figures. And this might be uncharitable, so any of the Losurdo heads out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but like history of thought or history of ideas. Like I wouldn't characterize it as like substantive history.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. He was a lifelong Marxist-Leninist in the sense of being an adherent of the particular form of theory that I would argue was really crystallized in the 1920s as the dominant ideology of the ruling layer in the USSR. And for that perspective, the so-called actually existing socialist societies were seen as was an axiomatic thing. They were seen as being in transition towards communism. The idea that the USSR had achieved socialism in the 1930s as a step towards that goal, this was unquestioned. And for Losurdo, yes, certainly, even till his death in 2018, he saw China as continuing to make progress along that road as its rulers claimed and still claim. And so Losurdo, his particular interpretation, blamed the Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, in the USSR as having made a major contribution towards the eventual collapse of the USSR with an exaggeratedly optimistic claim that was made the USSR was closing in on communism, would achieve it not too many years ahead. And it's interesting that he is, I guess, in connection with this general outlook. He criticized, Losurdo criticized what he called messianic and anarchist visions of the post-capitalist society, which would have involved the withering away of markets and the state. So I think we can note here that Losurdo is a very long way from where Marx and Engels were in their understandings of communism, and many other communists as well. And I think his worldview is also distinguished by an understanding that geopolitical struggle between states is more important than the class struggle. So the relationship between those two things is important and complex, but I think he certainly did emphasize that. So I would just want to add that in terms of some thoughts about his politics. Now, before we move to talk about Western Marxism, that particular book that's had a certain amount of attention recently, I'm wondering if there's anything else you think listeners should know about his thought based on the other works by Losurdo that you've read.
Sure. And just like 4 quick points that I think will help frame the discussion. One, there's a general attempt to recenter and reemphasize anti-colonial and anti-imperial, well, as he understands anti-imperial struggle within his thought. Second, there's an expansion of the notion of class struggle to include anti-colonial, anti-racist, and feminist struggles against oppression. I view this as like kind of roughly consistent with like a lot of the Hegelian strands of his thought, depending on how you understand Hegel. There's an expansion of his notion of class struggle to include something like struggles for recognition. My apologies, that's what I meant there.
Could you maybe explain that one point for people who aren't philosophers, what you mean when you talk about a struggle for recognition?
Sure. Struggles for recognition, rather than say struggles over relation of exploitation, take as their primary motivation something like the reciprocal I was going to say recognition, but say identification or acknowledgement of the other's humanity or personhood for each other. I was going to talk, I will end up talking about that in more detail when we talk about class struggle, but as a preface, this is part of what he's up to. Additionally, in keeping with the previous point, there's an introduction of a concept and centralization of it throughout his analysis of, say, colonialism and its relationship to capitalism, of despecification. I might be wrong here, but it just seems that there's not much conceptually different between the idea of despecification and dehumanization. Basically, it just means the exclusion of a group, individual, or segment of the society from say, ethical, legal, or moral community. If there is like a sort of difference there, it might simply be on the notion of exclusion from a social grouping there, which I also view as broadly in line with the Hegelian strand of his thinking. And the 4th point is that Domenico Losurdo is like kind of a controversial figure, primarily because of the political stance that you so ably outlined in your introduction. Notably, his defense of Stalin and his later defense of the PCR as actually existing socialism on the road to communism have garnered criticism from various sects. And I mentioned this here because amongst his, say, proponents operating within the Anglo-American academic world, like, say, Gabriel Rockhill and Henry Hakamaki, Losurdo, like, they kind of contend that, like, Losurdo has been, like, blacklisted or blackballed by the Western theory industry, which, I saw a roundtable with Henry Hakamaki, and he was like, well, Verso, like, was really reluctant to publish the Stalin books. And, like, I don't know, man, like, he's got, like, 3 books out on Verso, including one last year. So, like, my question is, how do I get, like, blackballed by Verso if this is the case? Because it's, like, a really weird conception. But it's like, part of the vibe in the reception of Losurdo that he's, like, edgy, or, like, oh, no, that's probably a little dismissive. That he's just, like, a dangerous thinker for the Western intellectual left. I think that's a more fair way to put it.
Yeah, I think that really captures the vibe, as you say, among his supporters. I have a few things to say about his book on Stalin, but would you want to say anything more about his book on class struggle, or perhaps one of the books he's best known for before this most recent one is his book on liberalism?
I might expand. Well, I'll definitely expand on class struggle when I'm assessing the Western Marxism book, because I think, like, an overall fuzziness at, like, what class struggle is and like what the struggle for socialism is like a general problem in Losurdo. So I'll probably talk about it in more detail there. The liberalism book, maybe like a later discussion when we talk about anti-colonial. Like from my perspective, my initial impression of it was that they're like pointing out that liberal thinkers advocating for universal human like worth and freedom, especially from the classical liberal tradition, like Locke or I guess de Tocqueville gets brought up a lot in that book. Like that's just like kind of this might sound just, but like obvious, like you know what I mean. Like I'm not particularly like that interested in that kind of exercise. And like I think it's actually like kind of malpractice that happens a lot in like philosophy circles to teach a political philosophy class and not have colonialism like be front and center in any review of early modern political philosophy. And that was my initial take, but then you'll hear like commenters like I think Vivek Chibber did this on like the latest Confronting Capitalism podcast where he identifies Marx as like the lineal descendant of the liberal tradition. So I guess it gets some traction there, but I don't think it's like that say conceptually perspicuous in its critique of liberalism. Sorry, I guess I went on longer than I planned.
That's fine. It's been more than a decade since I read the book on liberalism, but certainly it emphasizes the many exclusions, right? For people who haven't encountered this, that liberal thinkers have proclaimed these universal ideas about universal rights and so on, while excluding the majority of humanity from that in all sorts of ways.
Well, I mean, just sorry, very quickly, but that just seems like more of an inter-academic debate in the way that it's like sketched out too, which may not be the worst thing. But if we're worried about liberalism as a political phenomenon, I don't think like Locke, like or like Montesquieu are like the people we're actually worried about. Like you know what I mean, or that the people on like I don't know, like the libertarian right are necessarily reading. But maybe I'm wrong. But I mean that's my impression.
Might be an interesting thing to do on another episode of Victor's Children to talk about liberalism today and how is social.
Please no.
How a socialist might approach it. But, so I'll just say before we move on, this it's hard to know exactly which would be Losurdo's worst book, but probably this book, Stalin, The History and Critique of a Black Legend, would qualify. There's an interesting discussion of this book in the appendix of a book by Douglas Greene called Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn. Greene's book, I think, is worth reading, and that appendix is pretty on point, although I would note I have some significant disagreements with Greene's interpretation of the USSR, under Stalin, which he characterizes as what he calls a degenerated worker state. So Greene is a kind of orthodox Trotskyist. But Losurdo argues that Stalin's regime was historically necessary because Stalin was a revolutionary realist. And Losurdo apologizes for all the horrendous repression and destruction that took place from the late 1920s on in the USSR. He says this was sadly required for the USSR to industrialize and move in the direction of communism. So I think Douglas Greene points out that in place of the so-called black legend, that is the demonization of Stalin, Losurdo sees only a white knight. And Losurdo ends up defending all sorts of claims that Stalin and his co-rulers made in the 1930s about the supposed conspiracy of former revolutionary leaders like Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin against the Soviet state, the idea that Leon Trotsky and his fellow supporters of the left opposition were plotting against the USSR to begin a civil war against the state, these kinds of things. And unfortunately, Losurdo was an associate of Grover Furr, who was a kind of crank Stalinist writer, known for quite notorious defenses of Stalin. I think Furr's writing on the history of the USSR is sort of similar to flat Earth believers writing about the Earth system or something like that. It's really shouldn't be taken very seriously, but that does tell us about when it came to writing about the actual history of Stalin, where Losurdo was. But maybe it's time now to dig into talking about Western Marxism, this 2017 book that's now out in English. So could you give listeners an overview of what this book covers and what its core argument is all about?
Sure. The core argument of the book is like a rethinking of the taxonomy between Eastern and Western Marxism. It's in a sense a response to Perry Anderson's, is it Reflections on Western Marxism or
Considerations
on Western Marxism? which refigures Eastern Marxism as Marxism willing to take power and implement socialism in practice, and also willing to acknowledge all the, say, conceptual, political, and moral difficulties that go along with that. Whereas Western Marxism, by contrast, is a sort of shirking of that sort of reality, or an outright rejection of both power, say the necessity of power in the implementation of actually existing socialism. His sorry. The result of that sort of major difference in orientation is a de-emphasis of anti-colonial struggle and national liberation struggle by Western Marxism. And broadly, the explanation for that in Western Marxism, sorry, the book, this is going to get confusing because the book has the same title as the subject matter, but whatever, is, say, social chauvinism on the part of the Western left academy or intelligentsia. I and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but on reading the book, I do not believe that there's like a further explanation of that social chauvinism, like within the book. I think Rockhill, the translator of the book and one of Losurdo's main proponents in the, say, Anglophone world, at least, wants to hook it onto like a labor aristocracy thesis, which I'll just leave for a side because there's much more competent people than me to talk about the labor aristocracy thesis. Although, like, the version of the labor aristocracy thesis that Rockhill seems to be proposing has a lot more to do with like CIA funding and, like, say, people's prominence in the theory industry than, say, like the way in which universities are reproduced, which is like a sort of problem I have with that analysis. Yeah, so that's like the core argument of the book. There's a variety of sub themes that kind of get laid out, and I think the best way to put it is like, say, if social chauvinism is the cause of the anti-colonial orientation of Western Marxism, then there's a variety of, like, say, argumentative tropes or patterns that Losurdo goes on to sort of criticize. One of them is sort of the idealization of the American Revolution. For what it's worth, at least as I'm understanding it, there's an early Italian Marxist that he cites on that point, but it's mostly Bloch and Arendt, from what I understand. One thing to note about the book is that Arendt is included in its ambit of criticism, which is something to think about. The second sort of rhetorical trope that I want to bring out, and sorry, just give me a moment because, as I mentioned, I lost my notes, is the sort of, I guess, what like a hardcore Leninist would call like the anarchist infantile orientation of Western Marxism, that is like the rejection of power and the state form and those kinds of organization as a whole. And that gets kind of also brings to task, quite rightly in my mind, the kind of fetishistic understanding of a socialist society as something novel, wholly other, or new that gets brought up in works, particularly those sorts of works that are influenced by like post-structuralism. But I believe, like, someone like Bloch would also be criticized by this. And, for its part, I think Losurdo primarily like kind of analyzes that impulse in terms of like an adherence to Christian morality and Christian messianism. Yeah, I think that would be like a fair assessment of what he's doing. So let's see. We have the idealization of America, for the rejection of state power. I'm sorry, just one moment. You know what? I think I'll leave it there because those are the sort of central ones. But there is a variety of like kind of like forms in which. Oh, sorry, yeah. The other ones are like the kind of characterization of third worldism by Western Marxism as like fascist or neo-Nazis. For that, I think he's like primarily focusing on like Frankfurt School critical theory, notably Adorno, and it, like, he's also pretty pretty consistent in pointing out the inconsistencies in some of these Western Marxisms on relatively clear anti-colonial issues like Palestine and Israel. Marcuse comes up primarily in that regard. And the other major thing that gets criticized in the book, and I'm sorry it took me so long to get here, was there's a critique of, like, say, I guess boomerang theory would be one way to put it, or totalitarianism theory. And that's like the sort of like wholesale identification of like Soviet Russia with Nazi Germany. The primary like critic there. And like honestly, I think this is probably like in terms of analysis, like the book's best analysis. The primary like object of criticism there is Hannah Arendt. But I think it's like sort of fair to like identify that trope in like the sort of thematization of totalitarianism and identification of totalitarianism with totalitarian thinking or the thinking of totality that comes up in like various strands of critical theory or post-structural inflected Marxism. So yeah, I would say those are like the kind of subtropes.
That's I think very useful. We'll come back and pick up, I think, on some of those points. I think maybe before we go any further, though, it's worth just underscoring that some listeners may be going, well, this book is about Western Marxism, but you're saying he's criticizing Hannah Arendt, and Hannah Arendt is in no way, shape, or form any kind of Marxist, right? So then I think maybe clarifying what Losurdo means with this category of Western Marxism or what it encompasses for him is worth highlighting because, many people might think that he might mean the same thing by it as Perry Anderson meant by it in that Considerations on Western Marxism, a book that was drafted 50 years ago and published in 1976. So could you say a little bit more about just what is in the net that he's casting when he talks about Western Marxism?
The net's actually really goddamn wide, like, to be honest with you. And like, to be honest, and this is one of the problems that I have with Losurdo generally, it's not like systematically expounded in any real or consistent way. I do think that there is like a genuine object of criticism there. So like, like Gabriel Rockhill will like kind of note that, what Losurdo is primarily critiquing is something like the Western theory industry, in which case, like, thinkers like Hannah Arendt or Foucault, who's also like sort of anti-Marxist thinker, depending on how you, well, no, he is, but an anti-Marxist thinker would be included in it. So yeah, I think generally what's being cast in the net would be those strains of philosophically oriented Marxism and theory oriented Marxism that get adopted and intermingle with strands of thought like French post-structuralism. Obviously, Arendt is like a little bit of an outlier there, or like Frankfurt School critical theory, and like get propped up, primarily, I guess, like in the 90s and early 2000s as something like radical theory. But I don't think there's like an outward definition of the category other than rejecting like sort of the exigencies of assuming power and implementing socialism within Losurdo. But like as a general vibe, like it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think it is a very, very wide net, and something that surprised me when I was reading the book was just how wide a net it is. Because to attack, criticize Ernst Bloch and Lukács on the basis of some of the writings of their youth, as they're just radicalizing in response to World War I before they write their best known works. Sartre, Althusser, all sorts of people who have a lot. Yeah. They don't have a lot in common sometimes, but they all get caught up in this, along with people like, as you say, Horkheimer and Adorno, best known figures of the foundation or the establishment in a big way of the Frankfurt School of critical theory and so on, all lumped together.
Sartre as a colonial shill kind of like threw me for like a little bit of a loop, honestly, when I was writing. But to be honest, like when it comes to like a book like this and its appeal, like Losurdo, like to be frank about Losurdo generally as like an intellectual, like I think example choice is something that he could be like widely criticized on, like why these texts, why is this viewed as representative of either an author or this author as a tradition, and something that's like deeply problematic in his work. I sort of want to, like, as much as like I disagree with like the individual readings of like most of the people in Western Marxism, like I think like as a response to the book, trying like to prop up Sartre or prop up Foucault or prop up Arendt is like sort of the wrong response to take if we think about the grip that it has on both activists and intellectuals on the left today, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I just wanted to point that out because it was so striking. I also wanted to highlight, before we go any further, that its books is very different than his book on Nietzsche, for example, which is a very detailed, scholarly study, exhaustive in a totally different kind of way. And I think all the things we're going to say are very critical about this book shouldn't necessarily dissuade people who are looking for a kind of a Marxist, careful, detailed critique of Nietzsche from looking at that book or some of his other books. but this is the one that he's becoming best known for at the moment, and most politically controversial in this particular political moment. So I think it's worth focusing back on this. So can you say some more about what you think, what are the strengths of this book, and then move on to talk from there about its weaknesses?
I'm going to be honest, like doing the research and reviewing this book was an immensely frustrating experience for me. And it's not frustrating because like I dislike Losurdo or the book, but more because there's like, it's a book that like I broadly agree with like the premise, but straightforwardly disagree with the kind of political conclusions he's drawing, and the argumentation he uses to like support the premise and reach those conclusions. So it's like I found the experience of reading it to be singularly frustrating. And I think like the best way to put it would be to say something like, I think like for a lot of people, the idea that Western theory or progressive Western theory, and I think more importantly, progressive Western theorists are not immune from something like social chauvinism, or might put anti-colonial struggle or national liberation struggle in the background for reasons that are not necessarily like in line with their politics, is like very plausible, especially if you're kind of familiar with where, like, say, high theory, I guess would be one way to put it, but like, say, more abstract conceptual theory tends to get practice, which is like universities. Yeah, so I would say like I'm broadly sympathetic with that line of argumentation. Unfortunately, and there's like a lot of things that I disagree with the argumentation, but I think the central thing would, I guess, be the politics. And by the politics of it, I mean like the vision of socialism and class struggle that gets argued for. And I think like the best way to like pursue that would be one of the central contentions of the book, which is that Western Marxism is a rejection of actual power and the use of that power to implement socialism. And one of the core pieces of Losurdo's argument is the idea that, like, say, the newly emergent socialist governments in, say, Bolshevik Russia or Mao's China were immediately placed under threat by imperial and capitalist powers. I don't think he thematizes it in these terms, but Rockhill thematizes it in terms of like siege socialism, which I believe he borrows from Parenti, but I'm not like a scholar on that issue. So, but just flagging it for people who want to look it up. But the idea there is something like, okay, well, obviously, a socialist government would try to do things like abolish property relations, ensure workplace democracy, all these sorts of things, were socialism to take root in a world in which it was not constantly threatened by capitalist powers, but because of, say, the lower levels of economic development in countries that tend to fight national liberation struggles like China or Bolshevik Russia in the case of the 1917 revolution, the number one task of a socialist government has to be something like modernization, increasing the productive powers in order to protect themselves both economically and militarily from imperial aggression. So like when you get to like Losurdo's kind of like actual politics when it comes to socialism today, he's going to throw his wholesale support behind state-centered socialism. And there's like a lot and like characterize anti-state or anti-authoritarian brands of socialism as something like, I don't know, like weird Christian morality, or like waiting for like the promised land to appear or something, which I think is frankly dismissive and ignores like the kind of conceptual problems there. But, aside from that, his focus is going to be on something like state socialism. There's a lot of debates that we can have about that. Like, you can have like a formal debate about like what is the function of a modern state within like, say, an imperial world system, or you can have like a more like, say, political theory debate about like democratic form and like the ways in which states may or may not be amenable to it. But I think like the quickest line into like why I have a problem with Losurdo's politics is just to ask like, what the hell is the state for? And it seems like the primary argument, both in Western Marxism, and this gets cashed out more explicitly in class struggle, is that the state is for increasing the forces of production in society, right? Now, like if that's the case, like there's like a bunch of problems that arise from that. It's like not like a particularly like non-obvious point, but just because I like citing people because like, I think thinking is a collective practice. Like Isabella Weber, in an interview that she did on the Dig, pointed out like, well, if that's your view of like the Chinese state, then like basically everything it does can look like it's done for the purposes of increasing the productive forces. And like, that in and of itself is a problem, because increasing the productive forces is like not a political vision that is necessarily socialist. But in some cases, like, increasing the productive forces can be like, a politics that is not recognizably socialist at all, right? So not necessarily socialist. In a lot of cases, increasing the productive forces looks like the search for profits and the extraction of surplus value, right? So like in my mind, like if like okay, well these two things can look the same when we're placing like say something like PCR China in the context of like an imperialist world system, like I say like a lot. Edit that out. No, don't edit it out. Whatever. But like, I like for me the central question about whether or not irrespective of like the taxonomic categorization of present day China as capitalist or socialist, like for me the central issue is like whether or not there is an increased attempt to extract surplus value from labor, and it just seems like that is the case in China. In that case, right? And I know the focus is on China in this case because that's where Lacerdo's politics lead. But I think like looping back to the Western Marxism book, like if you're going to critique Western Marxism for not having a politics that is recognizably socialist, you should also provide a political vision that is also recognizably socialist, and increasing the productive forces is not necessarily that. I think I should pause here though, because another problem with viewing like the goal of socialism as increasing the productive forces, and I'm perhaps being a little bit unfair because Lacerdo does pay lip service to the idea that part of the function of the state is also doing things like redressing like inequality, although there's like several arguments both in Class Struggle and in shorter essays on China when he says like, oh, increasing inequality can actually be fine in some cases, which is like wild from my perspective. But like, another problem with the model of socialist politics is like increasing productive forces is like, well, like what if your socialism is a version of eco-socialism? So I should probably pause there. Because you're like eminently more qualified to talk about that than me.
Well, but I think you put a spotlight on a really crucial issue. We should of course remember, it may again be obvious, but remember in Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels hail capitalism's role in developing the productive forces. Right? I mean, the productive development of the productive powers of human labor, economic development in its broad sense, all forms of technology and social cooperation that are involved, that can take many different forms, right? It doesn't. The fact that productive forces are developing in a society doesn't tell us anything about the social character of that, about who rules and to what ends these forces are being developed. And so when Losurdo talks about how Eastern Marxism is kind of the pragmatic, realistic kind of Marxism that's all about exercising power, as opposed to Western Marxism, the question of exercising power for what class, as part of what project for organizing society, those are really crucial questions, right? And simply saying the goal should be to exercise power just is, I think is a huge problem in not asking what kind of power, how organized, how, and to what end, because what part of what kind of a project for remaking society, what's the logic of how society is developing there, and all those things are just completely skimmed over in Losurdo.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair to Losurdo on that point, he does make a distinction between, say, like political annexation and like economic annexation of capitalist powers within, I think, the Class Struggle book, but he might also mention it in the Western Marxism book. So he clearly has like in mind like a vision of like power, like who's going to be exercising in power, who's going to be exercising power. Well, the socialists in power who would politically annex the capitalists. But like just like increasing the productive forces, like the kind of politics that can fit under that rubric are like pretty labile. Like you can call all sorts of politics that, and just the way in which he like kind of casually dismisses like issues of something like, I don't know, democracy or like anti-authoritarianism as like Christian messianism sort of renders those views like the kind of label conception problematic because you're clearly excluding some questions from the conversation. I will say that your note about like capitalism's role as producing the economic forces kind of leads me to think that like this emphasis on like increasing the productive forces is just like, for someone who's doing a lot to like criticize Eurocentrism, is just like a sort of like rehash of like the civilizational model of like development and advancement that you get like with the West, but he's just changed the protagonist in this case. But that might be like a little bit unfair, but I think it probably holds if put under scrutiny.
Yeah, I think it does. And just the absence of any of the spirit of revolutionary democracy that you see, for example, in Marx's response to the Paris Commune, or the Bolsheviks and other socialists around the world who were aligned with the Russian Revolution, celebrating workers' council power, and people responding to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 and other moments of incredibly democratic self-organization by exploited and oppressed people. Like there's just really none of that spirit, I think, at all in Western Marxism, and that I think gets cast aside under that excommunicated as part of that kind of messianic and anarchist vision of a post-apocalyptic society that he discorns at one point, as opposed to the kind of ruthlessly pragmatic kind of politics focused on the state that he's holding up as the alternative.
Yeah, I mean, like he seems to view like Western Marxism as like a wholesale critique of like organization as such, rather than like and yeah, some versions of it look like that, sure. But like, there's like a lot within the tradition that is like actually thinking through like what's the form of organization and does it need to be necessarily authoritarian or starkly hierarchical. Like I'm not opposed to like hierarchy in principle, but like we can we can call like gross inequality or like opaque and arbitrary power problematic from a socialist position, it seems to me. Well, without being like traitors to like the anti-colonial struggle. Like
anything else you'd like to say about this book in particular? I have one other thought I was going to bring up.
Well, just on this point, if not this book, like I guess the best way to put it is like a general problem I have, and I think this came up in the previous comment, is just like the theoretical kind of murkiness of it. And one of the questions that I have is like, well, what the hell are we doing if we're doing theory? And like it seems like we're doing like a bunch of things whenever we do theory. Like one of the things we're doing is engaging in polemics, which like clearly, like at least in my mind, clearly Western Marxism is like doing a lot of that. But like in terms of theory, and our role is like both theorists and like if you look at where a lot of theorists are working, like educators, like there's other roles in like working on theory too, which is like some theorists might have like kind of descriptive or explanatory objectives when it comes to writing theory, or sometimes like if you're a theorist working in the university, you kind of have like pedagogical goals when you're writing theory. Like Sean Larson wrote a pretty good piece in the last issue of Spectre on like the sort of self-education of the working class. And like one of the reasons why theory is important is because it helps people navigate the world, and like helping like say the aspiring working class learn to navigate the world should be our job as theorists. And it just strikes me that Western Marxism, like if you look at like the kind of descriptive and constructive aspects of theory, is like significantly lacking. And I might like lean a little bit on class struggle there, but like the concept of class struggle is like used a lot in the Western Marxism book, but just to use as an example of Losurdo in general, it's like wildly unspecified what the hell class struggle means. And like looking at the argument about, so like to his credit, I will say, like Losurdo is trying to like incorporate anti-colonial, anti-racist, and feminist struggle within a Marxist like perspective. And I think like any Marxism today that isn't trying to do that is like not a Marxism worth its name. But like looking at his argument for how he tries to do it, it was like totally perplexing to me because it works like kind of backwards. Like usually, like if you look at like the kind of history of like Marxist debates about class struggle, like and especially within the academy, like the general contention would be something like orthodox Marxism posits like class struggle as, say, a universal and a totalizing theory for the explanation of social change and conflict. And then, like, non-Marxist critics point out, well, what about like things like anti-racist struggle or national liberation or feminist struggle, these don't seem to fit within your framework. And then, like, Marxist theorists rework their concepts or try to figure out how, like, those struggles fit within, like, the kind of pre-existing class frame. Losurdo's argument, and, like, I'm gonna feel dumb saying it. Like, I actually think, like, I must be wrong because this can't be the argument, but, like, works backwards from that. So, like, he starts with the assertion that, hey, like, it's clear that Marx, like, intended class struggle to be like a universal and exhaustive, like, theory of, like, social conflict and social change. And, like, his evidence for that is, like, I don't know, like, citing the Communist Manifesto and, like, italicizing the word all when he says, like, the history of all, like, of all pre-existing societies is class struggle. And then, like, he'll point to, like, kind of like Marx and Engels statements and historical examples in which they're laudatory of national struggle or, like, feminist struggle, but there's no, like, kind of like theoretical sort of reworking of the concept to try to figure out systematically how it fits together. And in that sense, like, I don't think, like, if part of the job of, like, a book of theory is to, like, like, help people figure out how to navigate the world, I think, like, the book is, like, wildly unsuccessful on these terms. And, like, Marxist theorists who, like, take those issues seriously will, like, turn to notions like racial capitalism, or there's, like, the dual system, single system debate within, like, feminist Marxism on this issue. And, like, incidentally, looking at, like, the footnotes for that section, like, those debates aren't cited, which is, like, wild to me because, like, I think like, a lot of them are happening in his immediate milieu. But, like, yeah. So on that level, I don't think it's, like, a very, like, good, like, work of theory if we look at part of the job of theory as, like, describing or orienting ourselves to the world. And, like, I think the polemics take over the book so much that as a book of pedagogy, like, say, like, encouraging, like, workers or activists to, like, engage in struggles in a different way, it's not that successful because it's, like, almost like, because he's putting forward, like, the weakest and, like, the dumbest versions of the Western Marxism arguments. Like, just saying, like, it's Christian messianism seems to be like a way to avoid, like, real theoretical or descriptive or explanatory problems that have cropped up in Western Marxism that it might be helpful to reflect on. So that's, like, my other criticism of the book. I'm coming off a lot more negative than I thought I would be, and, like, this is, like, unfortunate. I feel it's not a good look.
I think the gap between some important issues that are maybe raised by the book compared to how the book actually carries it out, that's worth pointing out. And I think you're right about he's theoretically not very interesting. He's an orthodox Marxist Leninist who doesn't develop, I think
concepts.
Yeah.
Doesn't develop concepts. Sorry for cutting you off. But, like,
no, that's exactly the word I was grasping for. I also just wanted to make one comment on a historical point before we move on, because it's important, and people who don't know the history as well may not pick up on it. But he makes, of course, an important point that Nazi Germany and the USSR are not qualitatively the same, and that's a kind of cheap liberal idea that's very common. Lots of liberals and conservatives would today equate them, and you get this idea of both of them being genocidal societies and so on. Often, in the end, suggesting that the USSR was worse than Nazi Germany. You get that from people on the right. But when Losurdo writes about the conflict between Nazi Germany and the USSR, he says on the one hand it's colonialism and slavery, and on the other hand it's anti-colonialism and anti-slavery and anti-racism. But if you look at, of course, there's a huge difference between the exterminationist politics and actions of the Nazi state and what was done by, even the USSR at its worst. But it just completely conjures away the domination within the USSR of a whole number of ethno-national groups by the dominant nation within that society. Because starting from the mid-1930s, the official line was that Russia within the USSR was culturally and politically superior to other nations. Between the 1930s and the early 1950s, over 3 million people were deported within the USSR on the basis of belonging to particular ethno-national groups whose loyalty was deemed suspect by the state. So Germans, Chechens, Koreans, Poles, Finns, and Crimean Tatars were all subject to that kind of treatment, with every member of those groups being treated as if they were carriers of suspect traits. And there was anti-Semitism in the USSR as well. So there's, I think, a little whitewashing about the oppressive character of the USSR in relation to of its population that happens when he writes about it that way.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm bad at not cutting people off, but just to anticipate like some of the other objections, like that sort of point might get in some circles, like, if you're gonna make the argument that like, well, Losurdo ends up taking the PCR side and the Sino-Soviet split, like, I mean, these same issues are present in China, like obviously, like, as like, a lot of listeners to Victor's Children would have like been informed of, like, from previous episodes.
Right. So let's move now to just talk a little bit about the appeal of this book, Western Marxism. What's your take on, where the appeal lies, or some of the issues that are brought up around that and the reception of this book?
Yeah, and like when I initially took on full disclosure, I'm trying to write a review of this. But like when I initially took on the task, like I had expected to be more sympathetic to it because, as I said, like I'm sympathetic to the basic kind of like premises. So when you talk about the appeal of this book, like if you look at like over the last, just to be like take a limited scope, the last couple of years, like internationalist Marxism, anti-colonialism, and anti-imperialism are becoming more pressing concerns for people in activist circles and people on the left. And in a certain sense, like the contention that like these need to be integrated within a coherent Marxist framework is like kind of laudatory. And just to be like a little bit more specific, like a lot of the organizing around, say, Palestine has like sort of emphasized these issues. So in that sense, like that's part of the appeal. And to go back to the siege socialism point that he raises, and me and you might have some disagreements like on this issue, but like broadly speaking, like it does seem the case that like newly emergent socialist, well, it doesn't seem the case. It is the case that newly emergent socialist states are like under continual pressure, both in terms of economic competition and in terms of like military intervention from capitalist and imperialist powers. And like, thinking about, and I'm just going to cite the case of Bolshevik Russia because I'm like a little bit more familiar with it. Thinking about like, the sort of immense pressure that the Bolsheviks were under during the Russian Civil War would probably probably forces you to like consider like measures like war communism or the NEP in like a different light. And it seems like the kind of central traction that gets is amongst like, say like mainstream media or like liberal historian like figures who are writing like or talking about these issues and want to put forward like a conception of like say the Bolsheviks as like power hungry lunatics or something. Like in terms of historians, I haven't read Russian history in a while, but like Pipes and Conquest would be like kind of figures. So in terms of like counteracting like those sorts of visions, that seems like part of the appeal as well. And like, me and you have both been like kind of deeply critical of China in this podcast, but like, when it comes to like this sort of both mass media, liberal, and some of the more hawkish versions of like the left, like, xenophobia and social chauvinism does play a role in the representation of like what's actually happening in China. Like, so, I think Western Marxism will appeal to you if you want a sort of response to that, and particularly if there's not like a kind of substantive or robust like internationalist Marxist alternative that you either have access to or feel like engaged with, right? So I think like that is like part of the appeal. Like another like part of the appeal, and this is like probably the part of the podcast where I drag like academia, and like I'm a little bit worried because like I don't want to sound like a Jacobin article, so just like to get it like out of the way from the start. Most of what I'm talking about here is going to be my criticisms of universities as institutions, like, and the people that succeed in universities. Like I fully recognize that there's like a core of people in universities whose labor is exploited, who are genuinely radical and well-intentioned operating within them, and who work on the issues I'm going to describe above. But like, if Gabriel Rockhill wants to say something like, given what Losurdo says, we need to do like an analysis of the social reproduction of knowledge and theory. Like, yeah, like I agree. Like I haven't read his version of it yet. this might be dismissive, but I suspect that he just wants to show that everyone was working for the CIA, but like I don't like know. Like, but like, if you like kind of look at the places in which Western Marxism is sort of read and where like these texts are like considered and experts in them are built, like universities, like it's not like implausible to say that like these are social spaces and institutions that in which like say social chauvinism and racism are kind of rampant, and that has to deal with like a couple of like what I call like structural issues. I'm going to use philosophy as my example. Most of this is like sort of anecdotal, but like I trust that your listeners are like educated and thoughtful enough to see whether or not what I'm seeing here extends to like different contexts. But like like postgraduate education is like a sort of institutional framework that just primes graduate students and like lower level academic workers for like abuse. Like, and the reason that it does so is just because, especially in the humanities, although this could be said for some of the social sciences and could perhaps be extended to the natural sciences, like university, sorry, your dissertation supervisor and senior academics have like an insane amount of control over your career. And like this is especially the case in philosophy because we don't have like objective metrics of success. So like, it's sort of like the review of your work by like a community of like qualified critics, I guess is how they think of it. But that's usually just like a social circle who like all knows each other. And so like, if you have like a kind of institution in which like people are given like near and arbitrary like control over their subordinates, and b, if that like institution like exists in the society which kind of like filters success towards people from like say privileged class, gender or racial backgrounds, then like yeah, of course chauvinism is going to be like rampant, and like that comes through like even for like Marxist theory or like Western Marxist theory. Like I taught at like Adorno Fantasy Camp for like a couple years, and like some of the things that were being said there were like freaking wild. Like like the head of the program said once that like there's no native tradition of radical political thought in America, which it's like to me is just like straightforwardly racist. But the to hook it back into like the critique of universities and the theory industry, like you can say that kind of stuff because like what the hell are your like graduate students like gonna do, or like your students gonna do, right? In addition, like I think professionally, in terms of like a theory being produced, and this is like especially true in philosophy, like the field encourages you to make at best depoliticizing and like in a lot of cases just straightforwardly racist arguments. Again, I'll use like the example of philosophy because it's most proximate to me. But basically, like, if you tend to practice professional philosophy in the States, you'll either be, say, like problem focused, and most of the problem focused people like end up doing like Anglo-American philosophy, which is just like analytic philosophy. Sorry if I'm going on, you can cut me off at any point. But yeah, which is neither here nor there because they're not reading like things like Lukács anyway. And like, but I take to be depoliticizing, and I will avoid going on about it. I will just say that Charles Mills has a good essay on why the kind of like ideal constructions they use in that field tend to be depoliticizing or at best blind to like issues of power and oppression. But like, in terms of like a lot of people in both philosophy and like other disciplines like comp lit, you tend to be like figurally based. Like, I'm like the Lukács guy or I'm like the Althusser guy, and like that's what I do. And your careers both become like invested in these thinkers, and you're kind of encouraged by like the institutional spaces that you're in to like kind of sell like the political and pragmatic import of what you're writing on, like, you know what I mean? So like, I mean, you're Canadian, right? Like you've written a shirk application at some point. Yeah, it's like, like I really want to read like Benjamin on technology, but what it actually does is like tells you about multiculturalism or something. Like, you know what I mean? Like these sorts of things. So you're encouraged to sell your work as like politically relevant, and like, just to like take an example, like, I was like at a talk a couple years ago on like Rousseau that was in like kind of insinuating that like Rousseau and recognition theory were like sort of like vitally important for understanding like racism, which strikes me as like a kind of just straightforwardly racist argument because like what you're doing is you're increasing like for any student who's like interested in like thinking about race philosophically, you're just introducing the intellectual buy-in of that student into a canon that is like mostly represented by like say like white thinkers and thinkers, which, like as Losurdo points out, are like deeply complicit with like the kind of colonial projects of their time. And like, so I'm sorry, this is like a kind of long rant, but like, you know what I mean? If you're like a brown, angry communist like me and you tend to be candid, and you are attracted to Western Marxism, like the theory, because you want to understand the world that we're in a way that's like distinct from like narrowly class reductionist view of Marxism, like you'll probably encounter like some kind of like social chauvinism or racism at some point, and you'll probably find someone like Losurdo who's just willing to say it. And I don't want to cast aspersions on the people that he covers, not because like I care that much about him, but because like I haven't done the research to figure out whether or not like Georgi Lukács was actually like a like like committed to anti-colonial revolution, like you know what I mean. But like in that case, like there is a definite appeal for like Losurdo's book on that kind of gut level. Like you think that there is something wrong with like the kind of way in which you're being exposed and taught to understand like your progressive intellectual tradition. I feel like I've gone on a bit there, but like I did have like.
No, I think you've.
Is that usable?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Okay.
I think you've been very eloquent, and I think if we just also then note as you said, right, the fact that more people are for good reasons paying attention to anti-imperialism in this moment of Gaza, right? I mean, this moment of the U.S. enabling and other Western states facilitating the horrendous level of violence being inflicted on people in Palestine by Israeli settler colonialism. And we could add other examples of imperialism today too to this heightened sensibility around this, and people looking for that kind of anti-imperialist politics so to better understand and think about those things. I think that's good. But I think, of course, people, I think we would agree, deserve so much better than they would get from Losurdo. In
Yeah.
terms of a Marxism that actually does help us to understand and orient the fight against imperialism today and against racism and other forms of oppression that are all interlocked. So I do think there's something, even if the book itself has got so many problems, it's so weak in so many ways. The interest in it does have this positive dimension. I guess an unfortunate piece of the appeal, though, is also anti-Western campism as a kind of anti-imperialism, right? The idea that the only imperialist countries are those of the so-called West, and denying that, in their own ways, Russia and China are part of the global capitalist system and imperialist as well, although obviously not in anywhere like the same position as the US within the imperialist chain. But I do think there's something about that kind of campist political sensibility that also is part of the reason why this book has resonance for some people.
Yeah, I mean, like, sorry if I can just jump on this point very, very quickly. Like, and this is like another one of the problems that I have with like Losurdo, like, or like the kind of prominence of this book generally. Like, I'm of the view, and like, this is not fully thought through. This is actually like kind of like a little bit funny, but I had no idea what a campist was, like, until I started like being more involved in like left circles. For a while, I thought people were just saying campus, and I was like deeply confused by like this whole thing. But like I'm a little skeptical about like the kind of usefulness of campism as like a sort of uh polemical and theoretical term. Most, pertinent, I guess most like the primary reason for me is like I think it's like a kind of conversation ender. Like if you just start like throwing around the word campus, like anyone like who might otherwise be sympathetic to you will probably like stop listening. The other thing is conceptually, and I'm like of two minds about this. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure what to make of it. As far as I understood conceptually, campism means something like displacing sort of the class struggle onto like national or state struggle, something like that. And it strikes me that like a lot of the issues that are like kind of prominent or like important for thinking through for like leftist thinkers and activists are like cases of like anti-colonial resistance, like I don't know, like the issue of like Hamas or something, where what's being precisely like put like what's being put under strain is like a sort of neat distinction between like sort of class struggle and national struggle. And like someone like Losurdo, I think doesn't really help that situation. Like I sort of like outlined how like the way in which he expands the concept of class struggle to include anti-colonial struggle doesn't actually help like think through those issues like at all, because it just seems to like rest on the assertion that anti-colonial struggle is class struggle. And I'm not saying we should enter this like fuzzy morass, and that's like kind of what I'm like annoyed with like the prominence of Losurdo for like doing. But like, I think we need to like kind of think about these issues, and I'm not necessarily sure that campism is the framework on which to do that. Like, sorry, and just like another short thing. Like I would say like if you're looking for a Marxist who like, or yeah, I guess he'd call himself a Marxist if he was alive, who like thinks through like the issue of anti-colonial and nationalist liberation in relation to the class struggle, I would much prefer someone like Fanon. I know it's kind of like lame to say like don't read this or read that, but like just because for Fanon, like national liberation and anti-colonial struggle, yes, are part of the class struggle, but they're a problem that he thinks through. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and he, Gabriel Rockhill keeps saying like class struggle is like a kind of like educative process for like the working class. I don't think there's like many thinkers in the Marxist tradition that like do a better job of thinking through that than like someone like Fanon. And he does a good job of thinking through that because it's a problem. Like the entire final chapter of Wretched of the Earth is like dealing with like one of the major problems of like anti-colonial revolution, and that's the fact that like violence definitely is required, and violence does shape the people who engage in it. So how do we build a new society? But these sorts of questions are just like kind of shunted through the side to the side in like Losurdo's analysis, which is one of the reasons why I find it like corrosive or like unhelpful frequently.
Thanks so much for this. Any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I shared a lot. Oh, I will say just very quickly, like I do tend to agree with like the broader critique of the Western theory industry. I won't spend a ton of time trashing radical democratic theory or radical theory, but I will say that like if you do find the criticism of Western Marxism as like a kind of depoliticizing theoretical strand, which gets like kind of put forward in Losurdo compelling, I would suggest reading Isabelle Garot's, like, I think the book is called like Foucault, Marx, Deleuze, Althusser. It's those four names. I forget the goddamn order, right? But unfortunately, I don't think it's available in English, but that's like a pretty like solid like account of that. Because like I do think that like, if my comments about the academy are true, like the overextension of theoretical models, like especially like kind of meta-conceptual models to like understand political situations without like any concern for like whether or not you're like describing or explaining something is like one of the reasons why you might find someone like Losurdo or someone like Rockhill's critiques of the theory industry to be compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's much that we could, we agree on in terms of the criticism of the theory industry and the contemporary capitalist university, absolutely. And again, I think everyone who is looking for that kind of critique deserves better than Losurdo. I think that's the sad thing. But there'll be a whole set of links in the show notes for people who are interested in following up on any of these things. And I would also just say, if listeners haven't listened to some of the previous episodes of Victor's Children that are connected to this, you might want to check them out, covering everything from what is imperialism, what kind of anti-imperialism, are workers in imperialist countries bribed by imperialism, the USSR, China. There are episodes on all these and more, so feel free to check out back episodes of this podcast. I'll also mention that I've got a book coming out in 2025 called Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left, which touches on some of these same issues, and I'll put the links to that as well in the show notes. But I want to say thanks so much, Josh, for joining us on this episode of Victor's Children.
Oh, thank you for the invite. And everyone, please read, subscribe, donate to Spectre. If you want like a socialist journal that doesn't cape for police jobs, like we're your guys. Like, come to us.
Absolutely. I'm a very happy subscriber to Spectre since the beginning. I encourage all listeners to take out a sub to help Spectre survive. Thanks, Josh.
All right. Thank you, David.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show. since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.